is capturing, extracting value as an intermediary, as the platform provider. So, and this reflects, ongoing societal narratives, societal transformations around this integration of technoscience and capitalism. We can see it in things like new kinds of technological assets, big data, artificial intelligence, all these algorithms, discussion of these, and the kind of policy, political narratives around the centrality of technological innovation and knowledge assets to national growth. So you can also see it, I think, in terms of the way that technoscience is increasingly constituted by specific forms of financialization or financial logics. So return on investment calculations, corporate R&D spending, that sort of thing. But also capitalism is increasingly constituted by specific forms of technoscience. So disruptive innovation, we can think of Uber being a kind of example of that, where it's parasitic on existing markets and resources. So to me, technoscientific, contemporary capitalism, technoscientific capitalism is characterized by this reconfiguration of accumulation, corporate strategies, investment priorities, government policies, and so on around the extraction of value from the ownership and control of resources and assets rather than the production of new goods and services. And this capture and extraction of value is generally conceptualized in terms of rent and rent seeking. And we can see this in a range of people who are debating, hotly debating the problems of the crises in capitalism. And so we have, many thinkers and commentators who are increasingly highlighting the threats posed by economic rents or rent seeking to the economy, to society, to politics. And these are just a few examples these are just a few examples of books that have been published over the last few years. And there are obviously more, and there's more literature out there. And so we have people like Jeff Mulgrew, who was a policy advisor to Tony Blair, talking about the predatory form of capitalism in which rent seeking is parasitic on creative, productive, and innovative activities. We have Thomas, your book up there as well on the resurgence of rentiers at the expense of wider economic growth. We have people like Guy Standing talking about the corruption of capitalism through rent seeking, which is corrupting competition and innovation. And he's from the kind of left wing, and then from the right wing you also have the kind of libertarian wing. You have people like Lindsay and Tellez talking about the captured economy, where rent seeking is creating and reinforcing monopolies through forms of regulatory capture. We have others who talk about the contradiction of capitalism, the destruction of capitalism. The most recent example of this being Mariano Mazzucato's book, The Value of Everything, which just came out last week, I think. And I haven't got a copy of it yet, so I can't buy a copy in Canada. I have to order it from the UK, so it takes time to get across the ocean. There are other examples. David Harvey's up there. New Economics Foundation, there's people there who are writing about this in relation to land and housing ownership. The UN Conference on Trade and Development, they've got a report out on this. Oxfam America. And then you've got, as I said, it stretches across the spectrum because you've also got people like the Stigler Center at the University of Chicago, the Booth School of Business, who are talking about these kinds of issues. So, according to these authors, the problems with capitalism are to do with this, rent seeking, economic rents, and rentiership, primarily as an aberration of capitalism. Now, what I tried to do is, thinking about economic rents, it's got a very convoluted intellectual history. And what I've tried to do here is illustrate the different kind of analytical traditions. And it's not an ideal depiction. It's a work in progress, I should say. So I've split it between four main kinds of traditions, or three main kinds of traditions, I should say. Starting with the kind of classical tradition on the right-hand side. It's very difficult to get everyone's ideas about rents and rent seeking together and to actually coordinate them properly. And there's various reasons for that. This is a kind of heuristic more than anything else in some ways. So you're starting with the classical tradition with Smith, where he talks about capitalism as a kind of ownership and the emergence of an ownership class. as an anathema to the accumulation of capital, to capitalism itself. Ricardo taking this up and talking about the importance of differential rents, so rents that are determined by different levels of productivity of land, and basically the rent levels being determined by the lowest productive piece of land. Marx then taking this up again, mainly focusing on land again, but differentiating between differential rent 1 and differential rent 2, monopoly rent, and so it gets all kind of complicated and tricky to kind of trace it out. But Marx was interested in more in terms of the investment, so differential rent 2 being the investment of capital on land and the return that leads to, and monopoly rent, the power and control over land. This kind of classical tradition plays out through urban studies and economics, where both Ricardo and Marx have continued to be quite influential. So if anyone's heard of Neil Smith and the rent gap, there's a whole area in urban studies around gentrification and so on that has evolved from this debate. And then urban economics is a whole area around the way that rents are used to coordinate land markets, basically. The autonomous Marxists come in here as well. So they, the notion of like the social factory, commonwealth, cognitive capitalism is underpinned by rents as well. So the extraction of rents from these social this social organization and so on. Then there's what I've called an institutional tradition, but I might actually swap that to a pecuniary tradition. I think it's probably better to say it's a pecuniary tradition, where rent is treated as this pecuniary concept relating to capitalization that Jens mentioned in the last talk. So people like Veblen and Commons and the institutional economists like them who talk about intangible assets and the claims on future returns. But there's also, in this kind of pecuniary tradition, you also have people like Marshall, so the kind of early neoclassical economists talk about quasi-rents and theorizing capitalizing the time values of resources. So it's more than land in this case, where it could be technology, machinery, and animal. And so you capitalize the value of that resource over time. And so this is an extension of rents from land to other kinds of resources. There's a whole interesting period of time when it comes to rent theory at the turn of the 20th century, where rent disappears from kind of mainstream economics. It gets theorized away, and there's some good work by somebody called Lindsay McGoy at Essex, who talks about explains how the work of people like James Baker Clark on marginal productivity theory he kind of developed this as a direct counter to the work of people like Henry George. So that they theorized land as an asset away and turned it into, basically theorized it as capital. But it does crop up again with management theory, management thinking. In terms of, you've got Schumpeter, obviously. He doesn't necessarily talk about rents, but profits, entrepreneurial profits. But that's what he essentially means. And then the later resource-based theories of people like Edith Penrose, capability-based theories of people like David Teese, who talk about organizational asset-based rents. Then there's a third tradition, which I've called social liberal, which descends from people like John Stuart Mill and Henry George, who are concerned with things like unearned income. And this tradition goes through people, later liberals like R.H. Tawney, John Maynard Keynes, and then emerges again in the 1970s with the kind of more new liberalism, neoliberalism, if you like, of people like Gordon Tullock and Kruger, who talk about rent-seeking in particular, where they mean the exploitation of political power for economic gain and essentially the distortion of markets. And you see that again in political science with the notion of national institutions and corruption in resource states. So just to give you a quick example of a rent, this me shopping in the Gap. I go to buy some pajamas for my daughter. On the left side, they are $33. On the right side, they're $30. Same size, same shape, everything else. The only thing that's different is that Star Wars logo. You see that so these kind of everyday examples of rent. This is how to measure rents. So there's a ton of analytical traditions, a ton of different ways of trying to measure economic rents, and I've put some of these up here, trying to on a spectrum of like more tangible to more financial, if you like. people use land, obviously Ricardo, Marx, and so on. Other natural resources, and then location itself. So David Harvey does a lot of work on the rent from location. Then I put people in here as a kind of, I was trying to work out how do you put the kind of autonomous thinking plus Vebelenian thinking around notions of, the Commonwealth, social factory, habits of life, and so on. This is people's sociality that, that rents are being extracted from. Then institutions. So a lot of talk about in the discussion of rent seeking is about subsidies, lobbying, government fiat, trade unions, bargaining, professional licensing, and so on. Just there's an interesting. There's a lot more of the kind of libertarian thinking in this around the role of government here. There's an interesting statistic that I found out recently reading the Lindsay and Tellis book that while trade union membership has declined in the US, professional licensing has actually risen. And so there's this switch where you have trade unions decline and professional licensing has risen. And professional licensing has risen from about 10% of professions to, of people, sorry, not professions, of jobs, to 30% in the same time that you had this, that you have the drop in trade unions. Then you've got the more kind of intangible, ephemeral measurements around intellectual property incomes, around non-physical spaces, that sort of thing. And then you've finally got, at the bottom, you've got the financial kind of ways of measuring that are probably the most popular way of measuring, which is around ownership of shares, bonds, debts, classic kind of rentier perspectives here, financial assets, and so on. Okay. So despite this long history, or even potentially because of this long history, we're left with a number of differing perspectives for how do we understand rent, how do we understand rent seeking as analytical tools. So many different kinds of conceptions and explanations, many different kinds of measurements, methodologies, and so on. And so the rest of my talk is really an attempt to reduce some of this complexity by discussing this notion of rentiership as social practice. So how do we do, following on from Jens' talk, how do we do value? And how do we, how do we do value? How do we extract value? Rather than kind of treating it as an automatic process. It's a social process, social practice. And I'll start with some of the kind of problems in or with, I'm not quite sure, rent theory as it stands. And I've just highlighted four what I think are analytical problems here, but there are probably others that I've missed. Or there are undoubtedly others that I've missed. So first is around the notion of rent not being, rent, the kind of economic rent being a kind of a wholly distinct theory of value all to itself. So according to Milanakis and Fine, they argue that the reason that rent emerged as an analytical explanation was because land couldn't, people like Ricardo couldn't fit land within a labor theory of value. And so they created another theory of value which was connected, but it wasn't, they weren't integrated. So this is this, yeah, so they create this kind of separate theory of value. And it's not necessarily a major theory, I don't see this a major problem per se, but it does indicate that some of the complexities around thinking about, how do we understand this extraction of rent and this process, this practice. The second ambiguity is around rent being a fairly derivative concept in the sense that it's invoked as an explanation often for normative claims. So it's associated with, it emerges at times when people are criticizing political economic change and transformation. So Ricardo version of rent emerges at a time when there's discussion around the Corn Laws and revising the Corn Laws. The kind of social liberal tradition around John Stuart Mill and Henry George emerges when there's a lot more discussion around poverty and so on. You could have the work in the late 20th century around that comes from the kind of more libertarian neoliberal tradition is an attack on big government, all these sorts of things. So it's invoked as an explanation, as I say, for wider normative political claims. So it's not necessarily a standalone concept. Then there's something I've called rent ontology, which is related to the above, and the rent is usually invoked as a distortion of the kind of proper ontology. So it's a distortion of markets or labor or so on. So it's not seen as by its, it's not, it hasn't got an ontology of itself. It's seen as an aberration of the market ontology or the labor ontology, etc. It's seen as passive, parasitic, unearned, and so on. Then there's the final one, which is this notion that it's a corruption of capitalism. This is a far more normative claim. So as you saw with the books that I highlighted, a lot of this discussion of rent and rent-seeking is around the corruption of capitalism, the predatory on capitalism, the destruction of capitalism, as if proper capitalism does not involve economic rents. So proper capitalism does not have economic rents, essentially, is the assumption here. So rents are frequently treated as a problem rather than inherent to capitalism. And there's not an attempt to integrate rent into the explanations of capitalism, except in specific ways, like theorizing it away or treating it as a market coordination issue. So I think to me, this is, it opens up lots of possibilities around thinking about rent and rent seeking, provides the rationale for me to start developing this notion of rentiership. So I want to emphasize that I see rent as an active social practice or process. It involves this ownership and control of resources and assets as a way of capturing value from them, and capturing value from either the inherent or the constructed productivity, scarcity, or qualities of those resources or assets. And this then opens up questions around things we have to understand. So how do rents arise? Where do they come from? What mechanisms are involved in their creation? How do people identify or learn about rents? Do they actively seek them, or do they passively wait for them? And so on. So my starting point, so a lot of this literature on rent is premised on the idea that rents, as I say, keep on emphasizing, result from this exploitation of resources and assets, especially through their ownership, so property rights, but also through other forms of control. So it's not just ownership. And land is an obvious case, but it also applies to other kinds of assets, so intangible assets, financial assets, and social life generally. So, the autonomists talking about the commonwealth or cognitive capitalism and such like. And I think that contemporary capitalism, technoscientific capitalism, a lot of this issue around asset ownership and control and why it's becoming increasingly important is a result of various trends. And some of these involve production and consumption, so the increasing tendency towards zero marginal cost of production when it comes to things like information technologies, social media, that sort of thing. Network effects, so more users, meaning that the more users that particular platforms have means it becomes more and more useful. Forms of prosumption, so that's the way that consumers are creating content for these sorts of things. There are also other kinds of reconfigurations of the economy and technology, attempts to stop competition, basically, forms of attempts to create certainty for shareholders and to maintain, sustain financialized logics and such like. The graph on the right-hand side is just an indication of the importance of assets in comparison to commodities, and it's obviously it's purely indicative because it's an n-gram image which shows the references to commodity and asset over time in books, in Google Books. But it gives you an indication of the fact that the red line is asset and the blue line is commodity, and you have this kind of, over time, you have this changing emphasis, at least in the books. The start's 1800. So yeah, so 1800. There starts at 1800. You have an interesting jump in 1900. I'm presuming around financial assets could post-corporate revolution. And so you have much more discussion of financial assets. And around about 1970, which I presume is housing assets, as you have a growth. So that's what I'm assuming. And you need to look at it to study to see whether that's actually an accurate guess. But that would be my guess. So instead of Marx's notion of being confronted by an immense accumulation of commodities, I think we're confronted by an immense appropriation of assets, basically. And there are a diverse array of things are being turned into assets. And this is infrastructure. Think of infrastructure assets, data, personal data, knowledge, our bodies, our bodily tissues, personalities. You saw with PewDiePie, his personality being turned into an asset. The climate, through things like climate trading and so on. They're all being turned into an asset. and an asset being defined as a resource. This is according to the International Accounting Standards. To quote them, an asset is a resource that is controlled by the entity as a result of past events, for example, purchase or self-creation, and from which future economic benefits, inflows of cash or other assets are expected. And this involves, an asset involves three critical attributes: identifiability, control, future economic benefits. And so I see this as the importance of assetization in contrast to, say, commodification, where we're turning all these more and more things into assets, basically, into this asset form. And the asset form is made by establishing the boundary to assets. So through a range of different kinds of knowledges, practices, actors, and so on. And this involves things like accounting rules, political economic recategorization of things. So if you think of personal data is now being framed as a new kind of asset class, and an array of experts and policymakers who seek to establish the value of these assets and validate these assets. There's a whole sort of there's an interesting discussion around how do you identify an asset, how do you create its boundary that I can't really go into, but there was an important change in 2008 in the system of national accounts, which sought to incorporate R&D spending and spending on creative works, changing that from an expense to into an asset creation. And that changed just from that simple accounting change, that changed the value of the GDP in the US quite dramatically in 2012 or 13. I can't remember which date it was exactly. So all of this matters because it changes the way we understand the world and how we can, we can understand the extraction of value in the world. So we need to understand how are rents then made from, how are they extracted from this ownership and control of assets. It's not an automatic process. It's not passive. They're actively captured and extracted. So we have to look at how do people identify rents, how do they value them, how do they extract them. From my, I've kind of currently thinking about three kind of main mechanisms for extracting rents, which I've highlighted here, which could be thought of different forms of rentiership. The first being government fiat. So just the simple act of government decision-making. So something like I think a really good article by Romain Felly talking about the emissions trading and talking about this as a form of the creation of a climate rent in which governments create an entitlement to emit, and then they simply grant that entitlement to firms who can then capture value from it. So that would be a form of government fiat. Another version, mechanism or form of rentiership would be monopoly. So a lot of people have talked about. I've talked about monopoly rents in relation to intellectual property rights, for example. And these are, unique assets that are hard to replicate or substitute. So something like the copyright for the music of a particular band would be an example. A third kind of mechanism or form of rentiership would be the reconfiguration of markets in technoscience. And this is what I've written about myself. And this is a kind of way of, it's not simply that rents are then aberrations of markets. Markets are changed and reconfigured to capture rents. And I put up here, does anyone know who that is? Yes. Okay. Shout.
Forget his name.
Okay. Yeah. Martin Shkreli. Yeah, he was recently, I think he was recently sentenced to several years in prison for defrauding investors. But he was most famous previously because he was the ex-CEO of Turing Pharmaceuticals. And I think it's a really good example of what I'm trying to get at here when it comes to these three kinds of different forms of rentiership. Because on the one hand, some people think that what he did in what Turing Pharmaceutical did is a classic case of government fiat or monopoly, but I think it's actually a good example of all three. So what they did is they bought the rights to sell a drug called Daraprim, I think. It was an old drug, and they bought the rights of a company. And what they did was that it's because it's an old drug, there's no intellectual property stopping other people producing it. But what they did is the company decided that the best way of extracting value was to use the FDA's market exclusivity regulations for testing old drugs. So if you test an old drug, you get market exclusivity for a year and a half, something like that. And that means that you stop anyone else selling it. So, or you can sell it and no one else can, unless other people do the testing. So other people can do the testing, right? Now, what they did, and this is where I think the market reconfiguration of markets comes in, is that they basically persuaded the previous license holder to stop producing the drug before they bought it, before they bought the rights. So there's no actual drugs available for anyone else to do the market testing. And the only way you could get the drugs is buying them off Turin. So essentially what you've done is you've bought the rights, and then you've got this market exclusivity by doing the testing, and no one else can do the testing, and so no one else can sell the drug. Then they ramped up the price 5,000%, I think. So from about $13, a tablet to, I can't remember, 500, 700, something crazy. Anyway, I think he's a man with an unfortunate smile as well, I think. Yeah. Well, he's in prison now, so yeah. Okay, so my final slide then. And I think, have I got a couple of minutes? Yeah? Okay, 2, okay. So I think rentiership is, what I'm trying to do with rentiership as a concept is trying to get over, resolve these problems of rent, and plus think about future kind of research questions that are important that I think would be important to address. And I think rentiership helps to resolve the problem of this notion of rent seeking as being kind of passive activity. I think it's much more of an active process or practice. It necessitates social actors making decisions, making choices, producing knowledge and claims, all these sorts of things, working with accounting and valuation practices and such like. And this obviously raises questions about how different rents are made and and who gets to make them, and the obverse. How are rents not made, and how do people not make them? I think it's also helpful. Rentiership helps to think about rents as being inherent to contemporary capitalism, rather than being this kind of aberration, if you like. And I think this is especially the case in the extraction of value from kind of the technoscientific-ized social life, Facebook, Google, YouTube, all these sorts of things where you can extract value from the commonwealth or externalities or what have you. It's also used, and this can also relate to the intangible assets and the discounting of expectations of future earnings that Jens was talking about in the previous talk. I also think that another useful way of thinking about rentiership is this notion of symmetry, which comes from STS, Science and Technology Studies, and it's good. It's a useful kind of way of thinking about and analyzing, say, bad rents and good rents. So we're not just saying rents are bad. We're thinking there's some rents may be good, and this is particularly the case in light of future technoscientific transformation. So if we think about the threat of precarious work, and actually we may want to certain kinds of rent seeking, like labor protections or labor unions and so on, professional licensing, maybe actually be a way of protecting against that the precarity of future work. The same might be said of, say, automation. The automation of work, we may want to protect forms of personal rentiership, like PewDiePie. He can extract value from his personality. We may want to protect that kind of thing as well. And there are other various forms of ways that we may want to think about the rentiership as being a potential benefit in light of future change. I think there's a lot of empirical questions here as well. This is the end. So, around rents and assets having particular kinds of materialities, geographies, and socialities. So different assets have very different materialities to them. Land is very different from knowledge. When it comes to geographies, there are different kinds of assets have different boundaries. There's some interesting work by Kelly Kay, who's looking at nature reserves in northeast the United States, and the ways that the community was trying to extract rents from enclosing areas of land as a nature reserve, and then extracting rents through tourism and so on. And they also have sociality in the sense that a lot of people's lives are dominated by assets and the extraction of value from assets, housing assets, for example, being the classic case. That's it. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Kean. Again, we have 15 minutes time for discussion. Jens Beckert.
Yes, thank you. That is highly interesting. I think connects also very well to what I was talking about. My question is, I mean, rents aim at profit. Now, what is? I mean, I would like to know what is not a rent, yeah, in profits, yeah.
Well, maybe we should collect. Christoph Deutschmann, glaube ich.
Yeah, thanks you from my side too. One point that perhaps could be little bit deepened is the micro-macro distinction. From a micro perspective, it is evident that it can be showed in many examples, as you did, that rentiership can be extremely profitable for single actors. But what about the macro dimension? Can rentiership also increase or contribute to the growth of the economy? Of course, the classical authors, the answer of the classical authors, Ricardo in particular, was no. Rentiership also results only in a redistribution of income. What the loss is of the one is the profit of the What about is this? Does this still hold true in your view?
Still another one. We just there's no way. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to link up with that. So the productivity of rents in capitalism. I'm interested in a financial rent-driven explanation, historical explanation of capitalism. When you look at, when we go back to the graph you had about the proportion of rent as against commodities,
Well,
the historical graph.
That was asset. That was asset commodity. It wasn't rent and commodity.
All right, okay, but I can continue on that.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, it makes the impression that this is growing over time. But I think you can make an excellent argument that in the 18th century with the financial explosion in the UK, where, you know, in the middle of the 18th century, the UK has about 250, 300% of GDP in financial debt standing out as a state, mainly to the Netherlands, in fact. You know, so UK-based capitalist transformation is very much driven by rent-taking, by an earlier rent-taking class located in the Netherlands. So these are interesting things to think about.
Okay, so Kean.
Okay, so when it comes to what is not a rent, I think it does connect up to everything. So I think I see a lot of people talking about financial rents as being, so that's, you know, I didn't really discuss it with the slide of the different traditions, but a lot of the conclusion, it seems to be that when you look at measuring rent, what people do is they measure financial assets, right? And I think, Greta, your work on financialization, you mentioned rents a few times and how do you go about measuring these things. But a lot of people use that as particularly, of course, your work as well, on measuring, you know, the claims, those financial claims, and that would then connect into what is not a rent, and what is not a rent is something that doesn't have a financial connection to it, which nowadays becomes very rare, right? So most things are connected, you know, real world, if you like, real economy, recognize that they're not distinct. Real economy activities are connected to some form of financial economy activity and so on. Yeah? So a mortgage is connected to a financial, you know, a financial instrument which is connected to some sort of financial security and so on. And so there's a long chain of things. So if you start thinking in those terms, what is not a rent, it becomes very difficult to separate and distinguish between what is profit and what is rent, basically. And I think coming to the question of macro and micro, I think the macro, that's an interesting question because there are, at the micro level, we could say that maybe this is, you know, it can be beneficial if everyone is, you know, a rentier of some form or another. At the macro level, you might be right that it might impact on the growth of the economy because it becomes a zero-sum game where some countries benefit to the detriment of other countries. So there are a lot of work around intellectual property rights talks about the rise in IP licensing rents that the US, for example, but Europe as well, are extracting from the rest of the world. And there was an interesting comment made by one of the ex-CEOs of BlackBerry, so one of Canada's major companies, a guy called Jim Balsillie, who basically said he was complaining about rents, and he was complaining about the US essentially having a regulatory rent, or a standard rent, really. It's not regulatory, it's a standards rent, because they're the ones who set the standards for information technology. So any kind of information technology standards are essentially set in the US, and that means that everyone else is essentially paying a rent to them, and they're the ones that benefit from that. So so it's a tricky combination.
Okay, thank you very much. Two more couples, Chris Hand, Thomas Piketty. And Klaus Offe with a very small question.
I have a quick comment and then a reactionary question. The comment concerns you mentioned Tony in passing. Very briefly, you subsumed him under the liberal tradition.
Yeah.
But of course, Tony is a member of the Labour Party. He's not a Marxist because he thinks his Christianity is incompatible with Marxism, but he's deeply implicated in the extension of social ownership, Labour Party, national. I just invite you to rethink Tony in that context. The reactionary question is, it's prompted by your YouTube video by PewDiePie, because that reminded me of an old book, I think Alan Ryan, writing about property and political theory, very introductory stuff, 70s or 80s. He takes the example of Mick Jagger and his personality and the challenge that this poses, because clearly Mick Jagger makes a lot of money in the 1960s out of being Mick Jagger. You can imagine Karl Marx today making a lot of money, perhaps, out of being Karl Marx. But Alan Ryan does not need the language of assetization. In fact, I think he resisted propertization. And it was enough to talk about commodification. Monetization is the simpler, older variant that Wolfgang Streeck prefers. What is added? I resisted propertization 20 years ago, but I think that took off, and it's there in lots of literatures nowadays. Assetization, I have come across it. I don't like any of these terms. What do they add?
No, Thomas Piketty.
Yeah, at some point you said that about professional licensing, and like the fraction of the labor force under professional licensing went from 10 to 30%. So I don't know if you could tell us more about this and what are we talking about exactly. And also regarding the assets versus commodity graph. So if I understand well, books published in the 19th century did not use the word asset, but that doesn't mean they were not talking about property. So are you saying they were using the word commodity, or were they using other words? Or I don't know, in French they would use much more bien than actif, but it doesn't mean that they don't. I'm not quite sure what you wanted to make of this.
Okay.
Did you want?
No, Klaus Offe will be the last.
Okay. Tony, I recognize. I don't know. I struggled with where to put him, but he seemed to be, from what I read, other people's. Well, at least one other person's interpretation of him, they kind of put him in that kind of more social liberal tradition rather than the outright kind of Marxist tradition. So I put him there, recognizing that but it's a tricky one. But it's also I recognize there's lots of tricky positioning that goes on in that graph. So I think when it comes to the notion of assetization, what does it add? I think for me. I think assets adds something new in the sense that, and I did a graph of this just in case someone asked a question about it. So for me, I've been thinking about this in terms of like how do we understand the difference between commodities and assets, and how might this be helpfully illustrated? And I think this is just a kind of illustration of where I think there are different kinds of rights and controls that commodities and assets enable. And I think this is important to consider because you have issues like with a commodity, for example, the main one being that with a commodity you can buy it, you can destroy it, you can do whatever you want with it, right? With an asset, it's not quite the same, right? You can also, with an asset, you can also stop other people using it or accessing it or controlling it in different ways by licensing and so on. So there's different kinds of rights that go on with that. So there are these, what I've termed here at the bottom here, flow-through controls and things. I also think there's difference in terms of the way that they're constructed. as I've mentioned, there are different forms of ownership and control, supply and demand logic, and that sort of thing. When it comes to if thinking about Mick Jagger, for example, I think there's a difference between PewDiePie and Mick Jagger. I think Mick Jagger, his personality matters after he's done the music, I think.
No, it's the song and dance bit, the dancing too.
Right, but he has to have the music as well as the song and dance, right? He doesn't. He's not singing. He's not just. It's not just him. It's the music and then him. Well, with somebody like PewDiePie, he's essentially it's just him. It's his personality that he's put online. It's not necessarily he's going out to make money. We don't. I don't know what his motivation to begin with was necessarily, but he's put himself online, and then 7, 8 years later, he's 62 million people subscribe to his channel. He makes 15 million a year. You saw what he does. He essentially gets video clips and then talks about them, and that's what he does, right? Yeah. Okay. Sorry, it was licensing. Yeah. So licensing. This is about the U.S. in particular. Is the book by Lindsay and Tellis, where they're talking about the capture of the economy, and they say that there's been a huge expansion of professional licensing across a range of different jobs. So that 10% to 30% in the I can't remember the exact dates, but it's like the 1970s to today, basically. And it includes the jobs you would expect, so dentistry, doctors, lawyers, but it also includes other jobs. So, and it depends on states. So different states have different licensing laws. So some states, hairdressers have to have a license. Other states, florists. I think there's one state where you have to have a license if you want to become a florist. So you have this expansion of different kinds of forms of licensing and certification in different professions.
These are public licensing, so this puts together.
Yeah. No, it's. I think it's the professional group. Yeah.
Okay. Last round. Aaron Saar, his neighbor, and a very small question by Klaus Hoff. Oh, well, just let him begin.
Okay. We know from standard economics that there is no such thing as a free lunch, right? Herbert Simon, if I remember correctly, has argued that 70% of all lunches are free. Because they would not be possible without the collective legacy of legal, social, institutional, and moral legacies and inheritance, and the epistemic legacies on which we build.
Okay, Aaron Saar.
Thank you, Kean. I was wondering whether we should talk about some normativity within your distinction, because I'm sure I've got it wrong, but you totally throw me out of the argument with your example of your daughter's pants. Because saying, okay, well, this is just, you can change the fabric of stuff, but people buy this, and so we have income. This is generated by voluntary expense of someone else. Every income is expense of someone else. So the only way I know of talking about a special form of income that is somehow problematic for economics is that we say, well, maybe we can generate income without risk or something. Yeah, and then we say this is different from other actors. But I don't know if you're talking about different forms of value. For some you think this is a justified payment, and for others this is not, because, well, PewDiePie produces content, people pay for content, end of story, right? And the distinction between Mick Jagger and PewDiePie is purely normative. Mick Jagger we know, and we have this narrative that he produced music before, and somehow it is justified to pay him, and not justified. This is just people being confused with what YouTube is, isn't it? So is this a normative distinction you're making?
Okay. Last question.
Dirk Inns, Flensburg University. So if we start with economic history, then we have Johann Heinrich von Thünen, a German guy, writing about these concentric rings. You're probably aware of it. So we have land rent because some of the locations are closer to the market, so less of the food produced is eaten by the donkey who's carrying it to the market. That, of course, is a real rent. So you basically have something about transport costs, and then you you have a location which is better because you have more stuff that you can produce and get to the market. Are you sure that you want to basically unite this together with, for example, consols, so like British government bonds in the 19th century, which pay 4% risk-free, which are completely monetary? So I think it would be a good idea to have a distinction between the real side and the monetary side, and then basically say, now I'm talking about the real side, or if I talk about the modern economy, I talk about the monetary side, connecting to Aaron's comments.
Okay,
thank you.
A short and brilliant answer.
The real monetary, I think, goes back to what Jens was talking about in the terms of value. How do you understand value? And if value is about people's future expectations, then it's all, real is very difficult to kind of identify in that sense. So it might all be monetary, it might all be financial, and it might all be just devolve into people's expectations. When it comes to is it Tunen? So I sort of subsumed, I guess I subsumed him under urban economics, urban studies, as that locational kind of rent. Aaron, is it all purely normative? Well, this is the issue. So can we? For me, rent and economic rent is purely normative at present, and I think that it's purely normative in a negative sense, that rents are generally considered to be a problem, and a negative drain on the economy. And I think thinking about ways of normatively thinking about are there positive and negative rents I think is an important thing, especially as I was saying in terms of future transformations that may lead to problems for a lot of people in the around automation, precarity, all these sorts of things. So I think that for me, that's my normative kind of position. I'm not sure. I'll talk to you about the pajamas one. I'm not sure I quite understood what you meant, but I'll move on to the last question. And then Klaus. A lot of it is to do with collective legacy, and that can be that's where the autonomous Marxists are very interesting, because they talk, people like Hart and Negri talk about the Commonwealth, and that's essentially what it is. You're extracting from this collective social heritage that you have. Yeah. So.
Okay. So Kean, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would like to make 3 announcements. First, there is free lunch for everyone here at the Institute. There's also, because there were some misunderstandings, free dinner for everyone tonight. I think it's a good chance to enjoy the garden, because the weather seems to be quite nice as normally here in Hamburg. And the third announcement, all those who will stay from Saturday to Sunday here in Hamburg should contact me during the break, because we are thinking about a tourist program for those who are from abroad. Yeah, so that's the thing. And then you can go downstairs and enjoy the free, although light lunch, and have some fun.
Thanks for that.